Yeah, so it is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dynamical Systems. Daniel is a professor for theoretical neuroscience at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim and Edinburgh University. And he has three major lines of research: statistical machine learning, neural networks, computational cycling, and inferring applications, and biomedical AI with significant contributions to these areas. And so today he will talk about deep dynamical system reconstruction for inferring computations from physiological types.
Okay, thank you very much, Arno and Nina, for having me here. Do you have to pointer by any chance? Yes. Alright. So I will be giving a quite methodological talk, but without too many mathematical details. So I want to talk about dynamical systems reconstruction. So unfortunately, I couldn't get rid of this red box here. So all the important equations are below. I'm sure most of you know what a dynamic system is, but just to make sure that we are all on the same page, I just wanted to mention that basically a dynamic system is any system that evolves across time or other dimensions like space, and that we usually describe as systems of ordinary or differential equations. And so if we look at a dynamic system, usually we look at time graphs of the different variables that define my system. And a very powerful concept in dynamic system theory is that of a state space. So a state space is the space spanned by all the dynamical variables of that system. And so the temporal evolution of that system gives rise to a trajectory in that state space, right? So if you take a snapshot across all variables at a certain point in time, then that's a vector point in that state space. So here I just want to emphasize that for something to be a proper state space, it must adhere to certain mathematical main uniqueness conditions. Yeah? So for instance, if you do a PCA on firing rates, then that's not going to give you a state space. Actually the opposite, it will likely destroy the underlying dynamic system properties. And if you like, I can come back to that later on. So what governs the flow of these trajectories is the geometry of that state space and the geometrical objects in that state space. And I think most of you are familiar with the term attractors. So attractors are limit sets within these state spaces. So this is my favorite toy example. If you have a population of excitatory neurons and feedback inhibition through an inhibitory population, then you might want to describe that by two differential equations, which gives rise to a two-dimensional state space. And what I've drawn here in light blue is a vector field that is given by these differentials. And what you can see here is that it converges, that whenever you, or wherever you release your system within this two-dimensional state space, it would converge to one of these points, which are sort of the simplest attractor objects you can get, any fixed point operators. So loosely speaking, some of you might recognize that this for some decades has been advertised as a very simple model of working memory. So a stimuli can basically push the system back and forward between these two fixed point attractor states. So loosely speaking, attractors are geometrical objects at which activity stays bounded and to which activity converges from some neighborhood, which is the so-called raising of attraction. So here separated by this dashed line. So what I want to make you aware of is that there's really a zoo of different attractors, right? So fixed point attractors are really just the most simple types of objects you can get. There are also line or manifold attractors that have been proposed to play a role in working memory. There are limit cycles, closed orbits to which activity might converge. There are periodic attractors where you have this exponential divergence of trajectories. People like Rabinovich and others have proposed this concept of heteroplanic channels, which are these chains of solenoids to which activity might converge, and which gives sort of a very a basis for flexible implementation of, for instance, cognitive functions. And then there are much more complicated objects like, for instance, this idea of chaotic itinerancy proposed by Zuda. So I don't really want to go into that. I just want to, maybe before I come to my next point. So just for all of this, you find some empirical examples in the nervous system. Yeah? So simplest type of fixed-point attractor is simply the stable membrane potential of the cell. Line attractors have been proposed for a long time. For instance, this is an example from David Tank's group from the oculomotor system of goldfish. Limit cycles, spiking activity of neurons, or this work by Churchland. In the motor systems, you find limit cycles quite often, chaotic attractors, heteroclinic channels. For all of this is evidence somewhere at some level in the nervous system. But I'm mainly putting this up to just raise your awareness that dynamics can be very complex, and there are all types of different attractor objects. And maybe sometimes it's good to go beyond just fixed-point attractors, because for other objects, I think there's some evidence out there. But the other take-home here really is I just wanted to say that I think in computational neuroscience we often think as neural computations to be implemented in terms of the dynamical systems properties of the system. Such as attractors and transitions among them. And on the side, I just want to mention that dynamical systems are also Turing complete. So you can, any Turing machine you can implement as a dynamical system. Okay, so what I really want to talk about is now using recurrent neural networks for dynamical systems reconstruction. I want to particularly dwell on some challenges in training. And so if you want to really obtain true dynamical systems reconstruction, then this is actually not so straightforward. And then in the last part of my talk, I want to talk about some experimental examples. So dynamical systems reconstruction in a nutshell. So I brought some example mathematical definitions with me, to which I come back to in the discussion if you are interested. But just briefly assume that you have some dynamical system, like here the famous Lorentz attractor, which generates chaotic dynamics, and you just have time series observations from that system. Yeah? So in general, we of course don't know the underlying dynamic system. We want to reconstruct it from the data. And by that, I mean that we might want to train recurrent neural networks on time series observations from that system. And recurrent neural networks are known to be universal approximators of dynamical systems. And then after training, you want to be able to generate new trajectories or simulate trajectories from the trained system that have the same geometrical and temporal structure as your original data. Yeah? And that's actually quite important. So how do we assess reconstruction quality? And that's, in my mind, a very important point that is sometimes overlooked in machine learning. So these here are two trajectories drawn from the very same system, from the Lorentz system, from the Lorentz equations. And because it's chaotic, they diverge exponentially fast. Yeah? So here, they just differ by a very slight difference in the initial conditions. So in real data, this problem would be much worse, yeah? Because you have noise in the system, so they would exponentially diverge very quickly. And the point is that often if we train on dynamics, or if we train on time series observations, we use something like the mean squared error, or prediction error. Yeah, and that's also implicit. If you have a Gaussian model, then that's the term you like to. But this is not appropriate for dynamic systems reconstruction. Yeah? And that is because even though these two trajectories come from the very same system, you see that there is a huge discrepancy along the time axis. Yeah? So, and this graphs here show that more clearly. Yeah? So here's an example of a trajectory that agrees quite well in geometry, but has a relatively high mean squared error. While here's an example where the dynamic system is clearly not reconstructed, yeah? So you just have this limit cycle, but it happens to have a frequency that is sort of well aligned with the chaotic oscillations of the Lorentz attractor. Yeah? And so you get a much lower mean squared error than in this example. Yeah? So for dynamical systems reconstruction, we need something else than just mean square errors or prediction errors to assess the quality of the reconstruction. So what we are usually using is we try to assess the agreement in geometry through, for instance, a type of Kubert-Leibler divergence, where we go across boxes in state space. Yeah? So we'll place boxes around or Gaussians around the trajectories, and then we'll assess the geometrical agreement in state space. Yeah? So this gives an example. So lower this divergence will be lower as the better the geometrical agreement of the underlying chapter structure is. And for chapter structure, you can use, for instance, correlation between power spectra, or you can use something else like the linear distance. Okay, so that's how we assess reconstruction quality. Now, the networks, the recurrent neural networks that we are using have this piecewise linear structure. So they have this linear autoregressive term, and then it's piecewise linear because we use the max function here as our nonlinearity, also called a rectified linear unit in machine learning, and then we might have external inputs and Gaussian noise term. So why are we using this structure? So at some level you might say, okay, there's a loose physiological motivation for that. Yeah, we know that many neurons, cortical neurons, in their input-output relationships in the physiological relevant regime are fairly often linear. And also you might want to see this as a discretization of a neural population model. Yeah, so, but that's not actually the major reason we are, you don't need this similarity or relation to physiology necessarily if you are interested in the system dynamics. So you can prove that the universal approximation properties still hold for systems of this type. The piecewise linear structure of these systems allows for very efficient inference and training algorithms. But maybe most importantly, dynamic systems properties in these systems are trackable. So with that, I mean, for instance, that you can compute fixed points and cycles and assess their stability analytically. Yeah, so you have these closed form expressions, and this shows it on a Wilson code example. Here we train a recurrent neural network, piecewise linear recurrent neural network on the Wilson-Cohen equations on time series, and it shows the agreement in fixed point locations and vector field. So piecewise linear systems have been studied for a long time in dynamical system theory, for decades. And there are so many of the important classes of properties and bifurcations are characterized quite well in these systems. And moreover, it turns out that you can go pretty easily back and forward between a continuous time and a discrete time description. With that I mean a mathematically equivalent continuous time description. With that I mean that your continuous time system would produce the exact same output as your discrete time system at those time points on which your map, that is your discrete time system, is defined. And that allows you, for instance, to look at stuff like continuous vector fields. Yeah? So that comes with a bunch of other analysis tools that you can use. So it's nice to have this property that you can go back and forth between discrete and continuous time descriptions. Okay, so now what we do is we embed this whole thing, this probabilistic description of our piecewise linear recurrent network. We embed that into a multimodal framework. With that, I mean that we couple our recurrent neural network, which is supposed to approximate our latent dynamic system, to a bunch of different modality-specific observation models. And basically, these just capture the statistical particularities of whatever observations you want to deal with. So in our case, we usually take models of the generalized linear form. As for instance, Poisson model, so all these models basically take a specific statistical distribution, and then the parameters are just some function of the underlying latent states. And then you can come up with things for calcium data, for behavior, and so on. So by multimodal, what I mean is we'll try to train these systems from different observation modalities simultaneously. We have developed several algorithms for that. In fact, expectation maximization in our hands works very efficiently, and that's because for the piecewise, you can exploit the piecewise linear structure. So for that, we have quite efficient fixed point iteration algorithms for maximizing the posterior. And once you have that, you can most of the expectations can be computed analytically. But we also have a variation inference framework for that in place. We also have a full Bayesian framework for that. And sparse feature forcing is something I want to come back to later. So I don't go into any details about the training algorithms, but if you have questions about them, I can come back to that later. Okay, and then at the end of the day, we retrieve our dynamic system and we want to analyze it further. So let me just illustrate how that works, some ground truth examples. So in this case, in loop, you have the true trajectories drawn from the, in this case, the chaotic Lorentz equations. And in orange, you have the reconstruction, both of the fixed points and the geometry of the Lorentz attractor. Because, as I mentioned before, because this is a periodic system, you have exponential divergence between trajectories, so they will never quite overlap. And maybe I should emphasize that. So these are not fits to the data or anything. Yeah. So this is we train the recurrent neural networks on the data, on time series observations from the data. Then we throw the data away. We simulate new trajectories. Yeah, and then we assess the overlap in geometry and temporal structure between the true underlying data and the reconstructed data. So this is another example for where we generated data from a biophysical bursting neuron model. This now is a limit cycle. It's not chaotic. Yeah? So you can actually get a precise overlap of true and reconstructed trajectories of the training above. But it's still a challenging problem because you have these fast spikes riding on top of the slow oscillations. Yeah? So you have this huge difference in the different timescales that define the underlying system. And I will come back to that point later, because that can also cause challenges in training. And we did that with a lot of variety of different ground truth dynamic systems. So this, for instance, is training or shows training results in a much higher dimensional system, neural population model by Landau and some Polinsky. Okay, and then the idea is once you successfully train your recurrent neural networks on these data, you can use it as a surrogate for your real system and analyze it further. So yeah.
One of these examples, it looks like you're comparing, and I guess your KL measure compares to the sort of limiting behavior. Do you know if are you capturing the transients when you initialize these states?
Yeah. So if I initialize somewhere near the space, and I just monitor all the transients, yes.
Okay, but those are a different set of measures to look at the transient behavior.
Yeah, so we can capture that as well if we look, if you carve out windows from the time series, for instance. Yeah. But it's a good question, and actually it's still an issue how to deal with multi-stable systems, for instance. Okay, so now I want to dwell a bit into challenges in making this work, actually. There are actually quite a couple of roadblocks. So the first one is the famous vanishing and exploding gradient problem that I think has been first brought up by Benjo and by Hochreiter and Schmidhuber. So assume you want to train a system like this, a recurrent neural networks, and for which you want to have a set of desired outputs, and you define some loss function, let's say in the Sitters case, mean squared error loss. So there are different training algorithms for that, but the one most commonly used, I think, is backpropagation through time. So for backpropagation through time, you basically unwrap your recurrent neural network as a deep layered network across the number of time steps that defines your time series, and then you do conventional backpropagation through that deep layered network. And as you do that, so if you have an error at any point in time, And then you need to backpropagate your error gradients. And these error gradients during this backpropagation process tend to either explode or vanish. Yeah? So that's a very common problem in recurrent neural networks and known for a long time. You can actually, mathematically, you can easily see that if you do actually the derivatives of the loss function with respect to the parameters of your system. So if you develop them according to the chain rule, you will end up with these product series in the middle of these Jacobians of your system. So they are the states of my recurrent neural network, and you derive them with respect to preceding states. Then you end up with these product series of Jacobians, and so you can guess if if the maximum absolute eigenvalue of these will be larger than 1, then it will just explode, and if it's smaller than 1, then your error gradients will decay away. Yeah, so huge problem in training these systems, and this is not just true for backpropagation through time; it's true for a large set of different training algorithms. Okay, so people in machine learning usually assess it through a variety of benchmark problems, like, for instance, the addition problem, initially also brought up by Hofreiter and Schmidhuber. So the idea here is basically the network is supposed to spit out the sum of two numbers at random points in time, and you make the problem very challenging by increasing the temporal gap between the two numbers that the system needs to sum up. And the classical architecture that has been suggested by Hofreiter and Schmidhuber in this famous 97 computation papers, many of you might know it, is a long short-term memory. So the long short-term memory is a type of recurrent neural network which has these gated units which keep onto a memory for very long times, which are gated by several types of input and output gates. But it's a quite tedious architecture. Yeah? It's mathematically complicated, it's not easy to analyze. So what we wanted to have is we wanted to stick with our piecewise linear recurrent neural network because we can easily analyze it. So how can we solve these gradient problems while keeping the model simple? And the idea, sort of a bit inspired by computational neuroscience, will take a line vector or a manifold vector more generally. So this is a two-dimensional state space, just an illustration. Let's assume you have two null planes in a perfectly linear system which overlap. Then on that continuous set of fixed points, that line, you basically can store any value. Yeah? So if you start from any point here, it will converge to that line, and you store that value on the line interval. And so that's the basic idea we wanted to take. And you can do more things with it. Yeah? So in Dynamical Systems Reconstruction, the more relevant thing might actually be that you want to capture systems with very different timescales. And that you can do by slightly detuning the line intervals. Yeah? You can capture very different timescales in the system. Okay, so we'll do that by regularization. We'll keep the simple piecewise linear form of our system, but we define a regularization term which pushes the system in a subspace to the line interpreter configuration. So, so basically, we'll just push part of the system toward the identity. But we only do that for a subset of the units, yeah? Because basically the idea is we want to encourage the system to form a manifold attractor for keeping whatever you put in its memory, yet you want to not sort of constrain its computation abilities. Yeah? You want to have some subspace free for doing whatever computations you want to have that system or like that system to do. Okay, and so this is just an example on an addition class, multiplication class, sequential miss or others, where we compared this, what we call now the regularized PLRNN, to various other systems. I think the details about this are not too important, but for me, the major take home here really is that we can basically keep a recurrent neural network with a simple tractable structure, yet it has performance on par on many of these benchmark problems with LSTMs and many other systems. Actually, LSTMs it outperforms by quite a large margin. Okay, so the more important thing from our dynamical systems perspective, however, is that you can also capture very different systems with very different timescales that are challenging because you have very different timescales, like in this buzzing neuron example that I showed you before, or like in these electrocardiogram data. And if you now analyze the latent spaces of your recurrent network, you find that the regularized states tend to capture the slower variations in your underlying system, while the non-regularized states capture the faster spiking behavior. Okay, however, there's even a more profound problem. Yeah? So it turns out that if you want to train your recurrent neural network on chaotic systems, you cannot avoid diverging gradients by a matter of principle. And you can see that basically by looking at the Lyapunov spectrum. So the Lyapunov spectrum quantifies the local behavior of trajectories. Yeah? So it basically tells you how quickly trajectories diverge or converge. And it's given by the spectral norm of the Spirit series of Jacobians. In this time here, in this case here for a map, yeah, like a recurrent neural network. So basically this is the term we had before. Yeah, so the Spirit series of Jacobians that you find that describes the dynamics of my underlying dynamic system, you also find that reoccurs in the derivation of your loss gradients. Yeah? And that this link has some implications. Yeah? So for instance, based on that, you can prove that whenever your recurrent neural network dynamics converges to a cycle or fixed point, the norms of your loss gradients will be bounded from above. However, if it converges to a chaotic vector, it will inevitably diverge. And this is true for all recurrent neural networks. Yeah? For LSTMs, for regularized PLRNs, yeah? So it's generally true. So you cannot beat this problem by architectural design. That's important. So what do you do? One technique that has been around for a while, machine learning, is teacher forcing. And so we try to adapt it for this problem. Yeah? So if you cannot beat the problem by architecture, then you need to beat the problem in training. Yeah? So that's the idea. So basically, let's assume you have observed a time series from x1 till x capital T. Let's assume that you link that to your latent states of your recurrent neural network just through a linear transform. Then you can invert that through the pseudo-inverse, like a linear regression model. And based on that, you can design control series by basically projecting your observations back into that latent space. And now the idea in teacher forcing is that you replace your actual latent states once in a while by those inferred from your observations. Yeah? So it's like your trajectories tend to diverge, and then you pull them back to the true trajectories of the underlying system. But you should do that at wisely chosen time points. Yeah? So you shouldn't do that all the time, but you need to do that at particular time points. And it turns out that these time points are given by the maximum Lyapunov exponent. Yeah? So the larger your rate of divergence is, the larger your maximum Lyapunov exponent, the smaller you need to choose this gap for training your system. Yeah? So the so-called, this is the so-called predictability time. So in fact, you can choose your optimal forcing interval according to the predictability. And so this is work by Jonas Michael and Zara Montferrat in our group. This is an example on the chaotic Lorentz vector again. So if you choose that forcing interval too small or too large, then you don't get anything useful, but you get optimal reconstruction if you choose it wisely according to the Lyapunov spectrum of the underlying system. So again, we did that for many different round truth systems. So this here shows our measure of geometrical divergence, and this here is a power spectral correlation. This is for different systems, LSTMs, vanilla RNNs, regularized PLRNNs. And what you can see is if you go for the predictability time defined by the maximum Lyapunov exponent, then your reconstruction will, on average, be best, both in geometry and in temporal structure. Tested that on 10 or more different ground truth systems and also on different types of real-world systems. So, for instance, climate data. So, in this case, of course, you don't have an analytic estimate of the Lyapunov exponent. You have to derive it from data, but this still works quite well. Yeah? So, even the empirically estimated Lyapunov exponent gives you quite a good guideline. Okay, so the important take home here is that this is a problem that cannot be avoided, yeah, and so you need to do something during training to deal with this. Okay, so another point is that usually to get a faithful reconstruction, you need to get to a very high-dimensional latent space, yeah, I mean, for those of you familiar with delay embedding theorems, that might ring a bell because it's known that to get a faithful delay embedding reconstruction, you will need at least 2 times the box counting dimension of the underlying attractor. And so you need to go to a higher dimensional latent space, and that, of course, makes these systems intractable at a different level because they become very high dimensional. So a recent idea we had is simply making the single units in this system more powerful. Yeah? So again, you might say there's a loose inspiration by neuroscience. Real neurons have dendrites. So let's make these nonlinearities more powerful. Let's replace the simple rectified linear unit by a simple basis expansion, which still gives rise to a piecewise linear system overall. Yeah? So we'll just expand that by a series of rectified linear units. And that indeed can be shown both at the mathematical level as well as empirical, that this leads to systems which give equivalent outputs yet a much lower dimension. Okay, so one thing I want to say is that in general we test our systems or approaches on many different benchmarks as well as real data sets. So this is also from a recent benchmark comparison. So there are of course many other groups working on dynamical systems reconstruction. So here we compare it, for instance, to different approaches like based on reservoir computing, SIMD, or neural ODEs. And yeah, so for us, I think the most important take-home here is really that we kept this piecewise linear structure. So we have a recurrent network with a simple, mathematically tractable structure, yet it's fully competitive with many other highly developed approaches for dynamic systems reconstruction. Okay, so last but not least, I want to illustrate some applications on real data. So how much more time do I have left? 7 minutes, okay. So we did that mostly on fMRI data so far. So for that you need, again, observation models that deal, for instance, with the Hamilton response filtering. This shows an illustration of a reconstruction. So in green are the real data, and in blue and red are reconstructions or simulations produced by discrete and continuous time PLRNs. And once again, I emphasize these are not fits to the data, but we'll just infer the initial state from the data, and from there we'll just simulate our system. And then at the end of the day, we would compare its performance more in terms of power spectral or geometrical properties. Okay, so it actually turns out on the data that multimodality helps. Yeah? So if you train your system on if you have multimodal data, then this probably improves reconstructions. But I think the most interesting part for you might be multiple single unit recordings. For that, I'll take as an example. So these are quite recent data, preliminary data, which are based on the rule shift task we already used a long time ago. So the rule shift task, a long time ago we did that together with Stan Perasco and Jeremy Siemens. So basically the idea is to train rodents on a particular rule, like a visual rule, and then at some point you'll just switch the task contingencies, and what the animal has to learn just by trial and error is that new rule contingencies are in place. Yeah? And then we'll track the rule and behavioral processes during the evolution. So what we found a long time ago is that behavior is usually not gradual during that, but you observe these sudden jumps in the behavioral performance curves. Yeah? So the animals suddenly get better on the task. And the same is reflected in neural activity. Yeah? So if you look at the neural representation as it evolves over time, you often find these sudden change points in the neural representation as well. And they're actually quite well correlated with the behavioral change points. Yeah? So that's was message a long time ago, where we showed that both behavior and at the neural level you get these relatively abrupt changes in neural representations and behavior, and these two correlate quite well with each other. So now we're trained to get more on the grounds of that, where that comes from. We trained piecewise linear recurrent networks, especially Maston in our group did that. And this again is just a set of examples of reconstructions of single unit activity produced by the piecewise linear recurrent neural network after training. Yeah? So again, these are not fits to the data, but they are reproduced after training the system. This is another example where, this is basically, these are single units. Here we will have population activity, which we project into lower dimensional space, and color-coded just the trajectories across trials for the different rules, and it basically again shows the alignment of or how well the trajectories generated by the recurrent network agree with those observed in the real data. And in fact, if we now train a decoder on several events like cue site, response, or reward, then it turns out that decoders trained on the latent space are as good in predicting the actual behavioral events as you can from the actual behavioral recordings. Okay, so I just also want to point out that maybe we also should pay attention to transients. Yeah? So sometimes activity might converge to something complicated like a chaotic background, but it doesn't do so actually during the actual trial, so transients are important. Now, for these particular sets of tasks, we use the non-stationary version of piecewise linear recurrent neural networks. That means we assume that there's learning happening, so our weight matrix might change across trials. Yeah? So for each trial of the animal, we accommodate a separate weight matrix. But of course, that would be a quite tall order if you want to estimate all of that. So we need to impose very harsh regularization constraints, basically smoothness constraints, to keep the complexity low. Then after training with these systems, you find that actually the weights between trials discriminate very highly between the different pools, but not between other task events. Yeah? So they have really captured the rule change behavior of the animals. So the fact that if you now simulate, if you just simulate the system and you look for change points in the simulated activity, these agree quite well again with those recorded or that we determined from the real recordings of the animals. And it turns out that changes in the W matrix are quite well aligned with changes in the behavior of the animal. Yeah, so you see that the structure here, for instance, changes sometime after the rule change. So sometime after the rule change, the animal keeps on going on the old rule, but then it changes its behavior, it's confused, and then at some point it got the new rule, switches to it, and you see another change in your W's. Okay, so we didn't analyze that much further yet. As I said, this is all preliminary work. So just to wrap up here, I showed you a bit about dynamical systems reconstruction using piecewise linear recurrent networks. I addressed a bit challenges in training. Some of them you cannot avoid. Yeah? You need to deal with them. Whatever training I will be advised. And I showed you some applications on experimental data. I just want to thank our group. So Jonas Mikael, Florian Hess, Manuel Brenner have been very instrumental in developing these methods, as Daniel Kramer and Philippe Bommer, who are not in the lab anymore, and Dominic Schmidt as well. Georgia Koppe is heading the computations psychiatry group, is doing all that from my work. Eleanor Russo, Max Sturm are working on the multiple single unit recordings, and Sarah Manfred is a mathematician working more on the theoretical background of our tools. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very nice talk. So, are there any questions?
Oh, hi. I have lots of questions, but I guess I'm going to go with the technical one first. So I was wondering about the issue of temporal predicate assignment and the instability issues with backwards in time. So in practice, if the grounded data generating process is a perfectly deterministic similar dynamical system, so when you're doing a mimic task, when the true data generating process comes from a data recurrent neural network, it is known that you're not supposed to do like long temporal horizon transmission backward in time. That's something like one temporal step, or RFLO are perfectly stable and you don't need anything else. Is there a reason to assume that in the case of these nonlinear dynamical systems that you're looking at, that's not still the case?
So mimic task is something engineered, right? So it's the and you have inputs defined at every single time step, right? Was that the case?
It can be, but I don't think it's specifically the drive that makes the distinction. The distinction is that the functional form that makes activity at time t, activity time at time t plus 1 is deterministic and simple. And basically, autoregressive, like doing one step ahead regression is perfectly informative for the underlying structure of the dynamical system.
Yeah. So to be honest, I'm not quite sure about the details of the mimic task. Yeah, but I mean, the exploring convention gradient problem we will always have if you. First of all, maybe I should clarify. So the tasks we use for training, for testing our systems, are really dynamical systems that produce some complex dynamics. Yeah? And it's an unsupervised problem in the end. Yeah, because you might have inputs at certain time points, but what you really want to do is you want to reconstruct the behavior of the time series, so it's an unsupervised problem. You cannot get around exploring gradients. That's impossible. Yeah? If you have any system like this, and this is also true for a lot of real-world data that we use. Yeah, we did it on EEG, electrocardiograms, climate data. You cannot get around it. Yeah, so I don't know what's special about the mimic task.
There are two questions maybe. So have you tried to vary the temporal horizon backward in time practically when using these models?
So I mean, implicitly, that's what teacher forcing is doing, right? So it basically varies the stretch of the time series that you actually use for teaching. Yeah? So maybe that's what it comes down to. What we are saying is, if you have any dynamic system, you should do that in an optimal manner. Yeah? And that optimal manner has been determined by the upper spectrum of the underlying system. So that's what we're saying.
And the other question about the fitting to data, I'm a little bit confused about the deviations from model assumptions fitting to real data, because you have like natural noise sources that have to do with the fact that the true system is not a closed loop dynamical system, but rather a partially observed
Yeah.
and you also have like measurement noise of various kinds. How do those get into your model?
This is maybe that wasn't clear enough, but it's a completely probabilistic framework. Yeah? So the latent process here is it's a Gaussian, so it has a Gaussian noise term, and we'll also assume different, whatever you see.
Okay, so the stochasticity in the dynamics result.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so that was great.
Yeah. Use of this.
Okay, it's just a quick question. So the question mirror example that you gave, how do you relate that to the teacher forcing thing? Because like it's
So teacher forcing is basically just a technique to pull the trajectory back to the true trajectory, right?
Yeah.
But usually people do it, you know, each time slot, for instance. There are some variation themes on that, while we here link it in with dynamical system theory, basically, and that's what we call sparse teacher forcing.
But because I was wondering if the bursting neurons would be able to implement that teacher forcing thing, because in a way they are kind of forcing a slower dynamics they are forcing a slower dynamic time scale, I guess.
So what is relevant is your divergence rates in your underlying system, right? So as captured by DVR. I'm not sure whether I got your question right.
No, I was wondering if the bursting neuron, like, well, maybe I'm not very clear on this.
Otherwise we can talk about it.
Yeah.
I think we should move on. If you have another question while switching.
Let's just. That's too distracting.
Somebody forced us in here. No,
Okay, so our next speaker is Matthias Hennig. So Matthias is the leader in computational neuroscience and neuroinformatics at the University of Edinburgh. So his research ranges from spike sorting to network dynamics, development of homeostasis in the retina and the cortex. And so today we will talk about towards interpretable nonlinear state-space models for learning.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this. This is really good fun.
The microphone user.
Okay. Shall I listen to you?
That one is nice.
Okay, great. So I'll be talking about a line of work which is to do with interpretability of latent variable models, essentially. And there's also the term nonlinear in there somehow. So you will see how these things can come together. Before I start, I'll just like to mention who was involved in this project. So the results I'm showing, a lot of them were done by Durstewitz, who was a PhD student here, is now a postdoc in Columbia. And together with Akash and Kai, who advised us on the variation inference. Also, I will show some results from Justin Jude, who is here somewhere. There he is. And the data that I'm showing comes from Matt Parrish and B. Miller from Northwestern at the time, and they collaborated with us on the interpretation as well. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge Nina, who gave us lots of advice on this, on this, although I'm not showing any results from her today. Good. So, okay, we have this already, so I don't really need to go over this. And here I'm going to talk about a specific class of latent variable model, which is the variation autoencoder. And I thought I'll quickly introduce it before I go on and show how we use it. So, quite generally, variation autoencoder is an efficient way of doing variation inference, where we have a set of latent variables, which are called Z here, and we want to transform our data that we have into this latent space. And here we do this by creating a system which performs this transformation and then performs the transformation back into the data space and tries to optimize the match between the construction and the original data. So this is the autoencoder part of it. And what we're assuming here is that the state space Z is a set of random variables. We assume they're Gaussian. And in this case, we can write down the inference of the posterior that we're interested in, which is the latent space given some data as through Bayes rule here. And in this case, we have prior over those latent variables, and we have to deal with the likelihood here. Now, this posterior here is generally, of course, intractable. So the principle in variational inference in general is to find a suitable encoding distribution which is just good enough so that we get a good reconstruction of our data. Right? And this can be chosen to be something more tractable, or as in this case here, this is essentially computed through a neural network. So I suppose that's the principle behind it. What it does is it transplants Bayesian variational inference, which is computationally complicated and expensive, into a neural network, which makes it easier to deal with. So down here on the right, you see the structure of a variational autoencoder. So we start with some inputs. We have an encoder part, which transforms this data into our latent variables. This is one box here, but what you have here, actually, these numbers here, they are means and variances of the Gaussian random variables that we're considering, right? And then you take a sample from this, and you typically just a single sample, where you can take multiple samples. You transform those back through a decoder, you generate the output, and then you optimize by making those as similar as possible. And as usual, there are lots of technicalities with VAEs, which maybe are not so interesting in this context. Also, if you're familiar with this view, so this plate diagram here shows the dependencies in this model. So we have this encoding process, which are the dashed lines, through our approximating or encoding distribution, and then we have the decoding step, which goes back from the latent space to the observables. So this is the general principle of variational autoencoder, and the way we use this here is inspired by this model from David Susello, which he called LFATS, latent factor analysis of dynamical systems, I believe is the acronym, yes. Which is a model that can autoencode sequential data, essentially. So the principle is summarized here. So on the encoder side, we take our data, which here for spike trains, we might have spikes and neurons, and we might do this over many trials, but in principle one could also do this over one could cut any kind of neural recording into segments and present this to the model. Then we have a neural network which transforms this into the latent variables. Here we use latent recurrent neural networks. And I don't know if that's a fair point to say, but I feel like this encoder should be powerful, and we don't really care about how precisely what precisely it does. It just needs to be able to do the encoding properly. So once we have those latents, this goes in the decoder part, which consists here of two components. So first we have another gated neural network, and then we have a transformation into a lower dimension set of factors. And the hope is that those factors, which are not latent factors in a kind of latent variable modeling space sense, but that these factors will be interpretable. And from these factors, then we go back to the inferred spikes. In terms of transformations, the factors to spikes, that, for example, so what factors really model are log firing rates, and the transformation then is more. Yeah, I think this is roughly in a nutshell how this model functions. Now, as in Daniel's talk, this is a model which actually assumes autonomous dynamics. So the way this works is that these latent variables here specify initial conditions for the dynamics of this generator RNN. And the generator RNN then runs for the specified number of time steps and generates the dynamics. And there's no, at least in this very bare version of the model, there's no further input. So this is all autonomous. And yeah, as I think when Manish mentioned that this is controversial, obviously a little bit, as to how well this works on neural data. This is a key assumption here. And the main, this model has been used in some interesting studies already. I think the most impressive aspect of this model is that it can infer single trial firing rates from spikes extremely well once trained. So even in cases where the firing is quite sparse, you tend to get a very good estimate of the latent firing rate that is producing the observed spikes. And I think this is still, this model is still unbeaten in performing this in comparison to all other models. Good, so now what we're asking is basically how interpretable the variables of this model is, and we can concentrate. We look both at this true latent space here, but we also consider those factors, because it turns out that what we can do from these factors is we can regress not only to neural activity on which the model was trained, but we can also regress on behavior, for instance, and we can see if we can perform behavior decoding from this. Since these are just a bunch of real numbers and variance, means and variances, of course, here we can only do categorical classification of behavior. But since we have the full time series here, we can also try to reconstruct more detailed behaviors. So the data that we looked at is comes from Lee Miller's lab, and we've actually, I think we've seen at least something similar already earlier on. It's this very typical experiment where a monkey holds a joystick and then has to perform a center-out reach in different directions, which are cued. And so the recordings then that I'm going to show here, they all come from primary motor cortex. There's also recordings from premotor cortex, for instance, available, which we have some data in the paper. Okay, so so a typical trial is that essentially starts at the target onset, so when this target appears, and then after some time, which can be variable, the monkey starts making movement, and this can be established from the recorded behavior when that movement turns on. In what I'm showing here, the data was actually always aligned by movement onset, but strictly we don't need to do that. So we can align by some other event in the trials as well. Those models would still perform quite similar. Good, so if we apply alpha to this data, this is what we're getting. So let's start on the left here. This is a dimensionality reduced plot of the latent variables. Here, just using t-SNE. We could also use PCA. What you essentially can see is that those different colors don't cluster very well. They cluster a little bit, but not too well, and the different colors represent the different movement directions. So, to some extent, we get distinguish different behaviors from this latent encoding, but it's certainly not perfect. So this is a model, by the way, which has 4 of these factors in the decoder, and the latent space is actually fairly big. This is 64 dimensions big, so this is not a limitation of the model. Okay, so those specify the initial conditions for those dynamics, and now you can see here those latent factors, how they evolve over time, and again they're colored by direction. So what's visible here is that we got some degree of entanglement of the different directions. And in fact, the behavior decoding that we can achieve from those factors is not perfect. We get about the direction about right in most cases, but for example, the dashed lines is the true behavior for these examples, and the straight lines are the inferred movements. And so you see that, for instance, these yellow lines here are certainly wrong, the green lines shouldn't be here, and so on. So there are some mistakes in this decoding. And the question is then, first of all, can this approach be used to achieve better decoding of movement? And the question, of course, is maybe that's not possible. Maybe there isn't enough information in the data. So this question we answered by just using a supervised trained RNN decoder, which gives us a sort of upper ceiling of the decoding performance that we can achieve, which is much better than what we see here. And the second question is whether we can find more informative latent factors, in particularly factors that might correspond to behavior, and maybe latent factors which correspond to other things. And so this is actually something that I don't know if you work with neural data, I think you will encounter this sooner or later. So you take a data set, some neural data set, record it during behavior. The first thing you probably should do on this is just to run PCA to see what's there. What you see is the first principle components typically show you some dynamics, but very usually they will not distinguish between different behaviors. So they can tell you maybe there is a behavior, like there is a movement, but if you have different directions or different types of movement, they won't discriminate well. So there's a lot of variance in the neural activity, which is not related to the specifics of behavior. And then if you look across many trials, you will see slow fluctuations, because maybe the animal state, brain state is changing and so on. So this whole system is quite non-stationary in many ways. Yes?
The models you put in, is there any like sparsity constraint or something that is choosing a basis in this 4D space, or is this an arbitrary set of vectors in 4D?
No, the only thing that we found that, so no sparsity constraints whatsoever, actually the contrary. So for getting good behavior coding performance, it typically helps to do a bit of L2 regularization to make the things a bit smoother. These networks can easily, like neural networks do, they cheat. So you might, for instance, because when we don't decode behavior, we just decode activity. So the decoding matrix that we use is same time, but if we allow flexibility, you get many solutions. So I mean, we do L2 regularization, but there's no other.
Okay, so any rotation of that basis would be equally valid.
Yes, totally, exactly. Okay, so to deal with these different sources of variability, there was a recent paper which suggested an approach to partition the late space of a late variable model into a component which is called a relevant part of this latent space. And this is, the model is constructed such that this relevant part should capture as much as possible of the variance that can be related to observed behaviors. And then we have an irrelevant part which should capture everything else, right? We can also have some sort of additional component here, which in this kind of model is essentially a noise term, which can be added as well. So the idea is to partition a latent space in a way that you get informative parts of the latent space that can tell you something about which components of the activity contribute to behavior and how do they look like. Now this model, preferential subspace identification key is ID. It's called, is a purely linear approach which tries to identify a good projection of the original data into this relevant subspace, and then it just applies Kalman filters basically. I mean, the paper has a dynamical system in it as well, but at least we found it doesn't do anything. The fitted transition matrix is a diagonal one, so there's no dynamics don't really matter, but it's this projection of subspaces into a good subspace that helps with decoding. And so what we did here was to take this idea and use this in a nonlinear model context. That's essentially what I'm trying to do. And so it's based on this alpha architecture again, where we essentially now have, again, we have an encoder as before. And then we partition the latent space into two components. One is this irrelevant subspace, and that goes and reconstructs neural activity. And then we have a part which is the relevant behavior-related one, and that also reconstructs neural activity. But it's also kind of it's a kind of supervised approach now, because we also enforce a reconstruction of behavior in this branch. So in a sort of, at least that's my interpretation. I view it as a sort of, in a variational inference principle, I think this is a regularizer of some sort, really, right? What it does. So we kind of try to steer the model by giving it some information about the behavior, and we hope that those latent spaces then will develop and separate and disentangle in a way that is informative for us. Yeah. So let's see how this functions. So here I'm showing a comparison between T and M, which is our new model, to LFATs down here. So first let's look at the latent space. This is T-SNE plots again. Up here you see the relevant part of the latent space, and this down here is the irrelevant part. Now you see a very nice structure here in this relevant latent space, which aligns very well with behavior. And actually the sequence of these numbers around the circle is the sequence in which the behaviors are ordered. Maybe also worth pointing out that this plot, a plot like this, can also be obtained via a linear transform. So we can use PCA on the latents, and we get a very similar plot. PCA on the LFATs latent space would give us something that could be completely mixed. Right? And then the irrelevant latent space is to a large degree is sort of mixed and tangled. And each of these dots, by the way, is a single trial, and that these latents are inferred by showing the model is by traits. So that's what there's no behavior information given to the model at that point. So then we can look at those factors again. Down here you see the LFATs factors. And up here we have two relevant factors for our model, and then down here two irrelevant factors. And so here you see those quite a nice separation into the different colors, which correspond to the different reach directions. Plotting this in 2D here would give you something that one could call rotational dynamics. So you have sort of a flower-shaped thing that appears. Of course, the precise shape of this is pretty unconstrained still. So you can have many different versions of this. There's there are no more constraints on the shape of this latent space of these factors here. They can appear in different shapes and sizes. And then we can also look at the neural reconstruction. So this is actually, here I'm showing trial averages for 3 different movement directions, 3 different colors. And it turns out that our model here achieves a slightly better reconstruction of, I'll show the summary data in a second, a slightly better reconstruction of trial averaged firing rates compared to LFATs. But on this plot they're essentially identical. So what it means is what doesn't happen is that we shrink the latent space that is totally flexible, and as a result we lose performance. We actually retain performance. In other words, this tells us also that the neural data actually does contain information about the reach movements, and probably more than we are able to decode with an LFATs approach. And here's the decoded trajectories. So just the visual comparison shows you that with 4 of those factors, identical models, but 4 of those factors here, 2 relevant, 2 irrelevant versus 4 factors here, achieves a better reconstruction. The comparison is not totally fair because, of course, we have here, up here for T and M, we have 2 decoders, whereas down here there's just 1. Okay, so here's the summary. We compare the decoding performance, our model to LFATs and also PSID, the linear model I mentioned. And the main effect on behavior decoding is that we can achieve a ceiling performance with fewer factors. So the cross would be 1 relevant factor, and that is actually not enough. So you see here T and M with 1 relevant factor has a lower than ceiling behavior decoding. PSID's performance with 1 relevant factor is very low, And if we look at the square, we have two relevant factors, and then one irrelevant factor is basically enough to get a saturated decoding performance with our model. So enforcing this kind of latent space separation gives a representation which is better decodable in terms of behavior. Okay, so PSID, by the way, here would predict that actually there are even five relevant factors don't get the full potential behavior decoding performance in this case, right? So if you wanted to ask a question on what dimensionality do I have to look to see the behavior, PSID would tell you a large number. VCA on the data would probably tell you 20 dimensions. LFARS might tell you maybe 4 or 5 or something like that, and our model says 2. Whether that is the true answer, I don't know, but this is sort of the difference, what we can read from these results. This is about neural reconstruction. LFARS is, in terms of Poisson likelihood, LFARS is slightly superior to our model. In terms of root mean squared firing rate, root mean square error of the trial average firing rate, our model is slightly better than the other ones. Okay. I have to 3, right? Okay. Okay. So quickly, a look at the decoder and what it can tell us, because I think. In my mind, the decoder in a VAE is actually quite interesting because on the one hand it constrains a little bit about what the model can do. I think by designing your decoder, you can actually start asking questions. You can ask questions to the model. You can manipulate your decoder and see how it reacts. So this is a behavior decoder in TNDM, which is a causal matrix. So it takes the factors and it infers future behavior from factors. So that's the upper triangle idea. It looks a little bit like, well, you could say it looks a little bit like an integration. So for any kind of time point in behavior, we have an integration of the behavior, by the way, here is x and y position of the hand. It looks like it's integrating over time the factors. And that would be an indication that maybe the quantity that we can read out directly could be velocity. And this is shown here. So here we have a regression. That's just a ridge regression performed on those factors directly to decode velocity. And we see these off-diagonal structures here, which indicate that, at least to some extent, the activity in those factors is causally related to the velocity with a time lag. So this is one of the little insights you could get from the model. Here's another, just for illustration shown. So these are 4 factors in TNDM, and their weights they use to project to reconstruct the neural activity. And I'm basically showing this to show you that both the relevant factors, which are the first 2, and the irrelevant factors all contribute to neural activity. So we're not sort of losing signal by performing supervised learning on behavior. Right. Okay. So that's our extension to this LFARS model, where we're trying to find interesting search spaces. Now, I quickly go over some other models where we use the same class of model. We address a slightly different question, but we also get insights which are related to the shape of latent spaces and methodology, how we can get interpretable latent spaces. So, what we're essentially looking at here is the fact that despite variability over time in recordings, there appears to be a very robust latent space that allows decoding of behaviors even over intervals over 2 years from the same animal despite significant fluctuations in what neurons are doing, also of course noise and fluctuations because the recordings are not stable, right? So, there appears to be a sort of stable manifold in the motor cortex that remains decodable over time without adjustments. This is work where the data came again from Lee Miller and Sarah Sola's group did that analysis, where they show that it's possible to project neural activity from very different time points into a common shared data space. And so what you see on the right here is an Elfvarts model, which was trained on the same data as here. It was trained jointly on different recording sessions, which were a couple of, I think we're talking about a week or two, something like that, days apart, basically. And you see those little rings here in the latent space, so each ring actually corresponds to one day. So what's happening is the model cannot merge these things together into a common latent space. It just makes its own little latent representation for each day, because there isn't sufficient overlap to bring them together somehow. So this shows you that these models are extremely powerful. You can squeeze a lot into them, actually. So I think pretty much any latent variable model would fail in this way if presented with this data, unless some sort of adjustment is made. So one can, for example, identify a latent space in one day, and then take another day's data, do a regression on that latent space to fix sort of what's wrong in that, what's gone wrong in this other day, and then you can use the shared latent space, but you would have to actually impose that. So Justin came to me and said, I can make a model where this is automatically discovered in an unsupervised way, and I thought, no way. But so he came up, this is the first model he created, which can do that. And it's trained in a way that's quite similar to the TNDM type model, where we again have a VAA style model. We have a branch which goes to behavior, and we have a branch which goes to activity reconstruction. And now the only modification here to the standard model would be to introduce a negative reconstruction loss on this spike reconstruction side. So the Poisson loss that's computed here is actually we're using the negative loss here. So what that means is basically it tells the model ignore the spikes, just reconstruct behavior. But since it's given spikes, it cannot ignore those spikes completely, right? It has to sort of this branch forces it to say, I don't want to know anything about spikes. I want to be bad on spikes. But this branch says, I need to reconstruct behavior, so I need to keep some information about the spikes. And it turns out that principle is sufficient to train a model which is now trained on a number of days to correctly predict behavior in an unseen session. So I'm just showing how this looks in a latent space here. So again, on the left here you see Elfvarts. Now these faint dots, it's a bit difficult to see. So the faint dots are training sessions. So each of these circles is a training session, and then these big blobs here, that's the unseen session. And the unseen session, and this is also unseen session, these dots here. So some parts of the unseen sessions end up here and some others here. Right? So that's Elfvarts. That's how Elfvarts deals with a never seen session. It puts it somewhere apparently random in the latent space. Now here's another domain adaptation model that we use for comparison, but I won't go into that here. And this is Sable, this is the model I just explained to you. And what you can see is two things. First of all, these big triangular blobs, which are the unseen session, now align very nicely with the different correct locations in the latent space that identify different directions. So it's possible to infer correctly what the trajectories are of this unseen session. And what I realized recently is, what's also interesting is this model also very nicely partitions the latent space. So showing a model like this, multiple sessions, also will lead to a better disentanglement. And we see that again in the next version of it, even nicer, I think. So this was the first approach to deal with this stability over time. But you need to train this model on many days, and you can basically, you cannot go far in the future. You can maybe, if you train it on a week, you can infer on day 8, maybe day 9, but day 10 certainly won't work anymore. So you have a limited horizon, because essentially the variability needs to be in the training data, and if it's not there, you cannot capture it. Right? So that led to the idea of designing a model which is now trained in a self-supervised way, where those manipulations are actually introduced into the training set. So we have a data set that we perturb in ways that we think reflect a little bit what's going on in these variability over days. So neurons are taken out, neurons are put in, neurons are shifted in time and so on. So various modifications that we could think of. And this model here in the top is basically trained to reconstruct the unperturbed spike, or tell us what was the unperturbed version of that spike train. Right? And that activity of this locator RNN is then fed again into an Elfard's model. And in this case, the Elfard's model is actually more like there's no behavior in this training at all. This is just trained on neural reconstruction again. Yeah, so the essential ingredient in this model is that the encoder also receives information about what's how the neural data would have changed between sessions. And so performing this, and again look at latent spaces, and so now we look at here on the left, this is the first unseen session, this is 1 day later. This is 4 days later, 7 days, 8, 11, right? So this is over a week in time. And essentially, if we want to know how well we can do on behavior, we can look at the overlap between triangles and faint circles again. And 1 day later, we have a pretty good alignment, so we have a pretty good reconstruction. And that's completely unsupervised, we could say self-supervised training on a single session with this augmentation that introduces the variability. And what's also interesting is that here, again, the latent space is very nicely disentangled, unlike the original Elfard's where it's mixed, right? We built TNDM to disentangle the latent space a little bit. Here, this is not even necessary. The modifications that we introduce somehow make the latent space more crisp, because the model seems to need that in order to reconstruct. So, over a week, here's some R-square values for 2 animals. On the first animal, where we had more neurons, the performance is pretty good over about a week. In the second animal, with fewer neurons, the performance drops much quicker. But any competing model, I mean, here's a standard RNN, here's Elfard's, they cannot do this prediction of unseen sessions. By the way, I just mentioned that because I think this is one of the things we found along the way. So I'm reporting R-squares here. This is an R-square computed with the scalar function on the behavior, right? This is absolutely not a good measure of how well your model is doing, because this R-square, the way the averaging is performed, you average over 2 dimensions basically, and no matter how you do it, you hide some aspects you hide a lot of detail. So an R-square of 0.85 is actually not so great. It looks great on a machine learning paper, but it means that the detail of the trajectories is not well reproduced. Nina worked out a new measure which can quantify much better how we should compute how we should look at performance comparisons when we have multidimensional behavior data. I just mentioned that. Okay, sorry. Good. Okay, so to summarize, the aim we have is to understand where does neural variability come from, And can we have models that can partition our data and be more informative about different sources of the variability in the data? And so, quite generally, I mean, the dynamics and the information that VLAs can give us about neural activity, I think, is very useful. It describes the variability very well, but it has this problem of entangled latent spaces. And what we've done here is by targeting this latent space in some way, and there might be many other ways how you can better do latent space discovery in these types of models, can give us quite interpretable views of neural activity. And I guess I wonder, yeah, how okay, I come to that. So maybe the last thing is when we got those results, we thought, okay, this is quite informative because it gives us a handle on what dimensionality we should care about when we look at neural activity. Because there can, you know, there's the work, on the one hand, there's work which says activity in the motor cortex is very low dimensional, and then Carsten Stringer comes along and tells us that activity in the visual cortex is super high dimensional, at least in a linear manner, right? So I think it's not a resolved issue or a resolved question how we should look at neural activity. Is this kind of latent variable model view really the correct one, or do we have to care about all these high dimensions? You know? And I thought, I think, I mean, it's a sort of contribution to the debate, I suppose. My question is now, how are these subspaces that we can discover, can we find a link to the neural representation? So what does it mean? How do we have to make a spiking neural network, neurons, that produce these behaviors? What are the constraints? And maybe the work Daniel presented with RNNs, which are a bit more vanilla RNN, maybe that can give us a handle on this, I hope. And then, yeah, okay, this again, I mean, this is a fun little piece to read maybe from Mark Humphreys, where he talks about the strong principle of dimensionality reduction, right? So the question I mentioned is it actually correct to do the dimensionality reduction? Is that the way we should look at neural data or not? You know? And it's an open question, and I think our sort of modeling helps address that and expose the different the questions that we have to ask to understand that better. Okay, so last slide, I was just wondering, we had these workshop questions on the website, so I thought I'd compare what I did to those. How can we cope with increasing data set complexity? I think we can do that. I think there's a tick. Certainly our models don't have an issue with large data sets because we use neural networks and we can burn lots of energy to train them and then have fast inference. Yeah. So can we deal with uncertainty arising from limited data availability? I think we still can do that. I mean, certainly not with our approach. Definitely, that's across. We need a sufficient number of training examples to train our networks. Maybe the Gaussian process models, which are better regularized, can deal with that better. So that's I think for natural behaviors and so on, and for some questions people are asking, that's a really relevant one. That's where we fail completely. Can we make good use of naturalistic stimuli or more generally naturalistic situations? Well, we're sort of working on that, I guess, a little bit. Maybe a 10, we don't know quite yet, but I think it's possible. Can we identify how neural variability is related to neural variability and behavioral variability certainly is related, but we don't have the full link, we don't have the full picture, so that's another question. I thought I'll try and tick those off. Thanks very much.
Interesting talk, so we have time for a couple of questions.
LFAT's model, so in that picture where you have the small rings, is it always the same latent space?
You mean, does the picture always look the same?
Yeah, like, so is, I mean, are all of those, so those rings are different trials, right?
each little, you mean something like,
You're talking about something
like this one. This one here?
no, on the next ones where you have the yeah, that one.
Oh, yeah. That's, so these, each ring is a session.
Each ring is a different session.
Yeah, and within this ring, you see little dots, and that would be a tribe. So these are tribes from different sessions.
Okay. And then that's all the same subspace.
That is a single latent space here. It's, I believe, 64 dimensions. Something like that. So you could say this is what.
I can expand the previous question. So, if you label the numbers on this picture, do you see patterns? So do you capture the relationship between these?
Justin, do you know? I would say, I mean, this is T-SNE. T-SNE,
Yeah, exactly,
T-SNE distance doesn't really mean much, I think. So one could look with PCA maybe to see. Yeah, you're right. They could, if one could compare that to, say, a von Rossum distance or something like that between sessions and see if there's a, if there's a relationship. Yeah, you need that for the thesis, I think. Yeah. It's time for coffee.
So we will meet again at 12:30.